Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ISAS Facebook Live once again. I hope everyone's having a good week. We have here with us today Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow at ISAS, who will share with us on the recently concluded, just over the weekend, the G20 meetings and how, for some reason, there was a lack of a trade agenda in this year's meetings. Welcome, Dr. Palit.
Thank you.
Now, firstly, the joint communique that came out of the G20 yesterday had little to say on trade. And if anything, it alluded, in fact, to the disagreements on trade, where in the fourth paragraph it bluntly said that we also note current trade issues. So for the first time since the first G20 meeting in 2008, the communique also did not include any pledge to fight protectionism, which is really rare. How do you read this jarring omission from the joint communique, bearing in mind that this is the first such document to come out this year, since both the G7 and APEC meetings failed to issue any communique at all?
I suppose the first point is that the G20 by itself was not in a position to arrive at a consensus on trade, because US and China have not yet shown any signs of coming to an agreement on their visions for global trade. The good point about this G20 meeting was that some thaw in the hostility was noticed between the two countries, but that happened outside the scope of the communique at a bilateral level, where the US and China decided to put a halt on the further escalation of tariffs on each other's products. So to that extent, I think what has happened is that this was a slight improvement from the earlier summits of APEC and G7, where it was impossible to arrive at a conclusion simply because the US and China did not agree on the similar content and language and expression on the issue of trade. It just so happened that the G20 on this occasion could arrive at a communique because there were a larger number of other issues, including sustainable development, gender, small enterprises, so on and so forth, which were good enough to produce a communique, but even then they were not good enough to produce a composite view on the subject of trade, because it remains very clear that the US and China are poles apart on trade, much as they're still trying to arrive at some kind of a working solution.
Interesting. The G20 joint communique also called for reformation of the WTO, so they could better act on trade wars, amongst other things. What, in your opinion, are like some of these likely reforms, and will they bring the WTO out of a dysfunctional state, as some have accused it to be in?
The first point is, I think we all say that the WTO is bad. And, the WTO has not been able to live up to expectations. WTO has not delivered. Well, the WTO could be bad, but then what could be better than the WTO? I think that's a question to which there is no answer that is available. So people propose reforms to the functioning of the WTO in terms of there being changes in the pattern of WTO being able to move on decisions. Right now it's a process where it's a decision based on consensus. And unless all members agree in the WTO, there's no movement forward. But the point is that if this is a pattern which is causing delays, if this is a process which is creating bottlenecks, and if this requires to be changed, then there is this fundamental question that not everybody remains as much of a participator in the multilateral process as all others, because obviously there would be some whose views would have to be rejected, even if one goes for a majority decision. So I think that there are some hard decisions which are to be taken. I think the WTO faces two major problems. The first is how to arrive at decisions. Second, what are the issues to be engaged in? In a sense, the WTO's agenda has remained rather confined to, if I could describe it as a baseline agenda, without moving on to a large number of issues which agitate modern trade now, including matters like e-commerce, digital trade, how to regulate state-owned enterprises, labor, environment. None of these are really issues on which the WTO has been able to regulate and administer. So to that extent, WTO has to get modern, has to become much more functional, efficient, and probably become a little bit more of an unpleasant agency. It can't just be all inclusive and all pleasing.
What about its dispute settle mechanisms currently, and do you think the current reforms are enough in mitigating any trade war situations in the future?
This is actually a serious issue. This is a serious issue because the WTO's dispute settlement process has worked well. Among all other factors, it's the one part of WTO which, in the eyes of most stakeholders, has delivered. But at this point in time, this particular aspect faces a very serious challenge because the US is not appointing judges to the appellate body in terms of taking this forward. So to that extent, there is a possibility that the dispute settlement grinds to a halt. Now, how the WTO will be able to counter this challenge is a matter of debate, but I think eventually the WTO will have to be prepared for a situation where an extremely important leading trade country like the US might back out from it. It could be a lead for some other countries in future as well, which are disgruntled. But then WTO would still remain a body for the majority of the world who would look forward to the body settling disputes. How does the WTO do that? What are the solutions in that respect? Maybe technology might have a role to play in this regard. I'm just thinking aloud that there could be applications by, let us say, artificial intelligence or other methods in which there could be a way of clearing disputes where the WTO is at a position where it doesn't have to rely on the whimsical decisions of certain countries, but it's able to nonetheless proceed on its own clear, grounded system of dispute settlement.
That's interesting. It certainly prevents countries from holding it for ransom as it is currently.
Absolutely.
Now, what does India feel about these proposed WTO reforms, and what impact would such reforms have on India?
I think India's position has generally been consistent in this regard. India has been a major emphatic supporter of multilateral rules of trade. So to that extent, it's supported the existence and further widening and deepening of the WTO. India has also been insisting upon the Doha development round of reforms and their agenda. It's not to say that the WTO has not been able to deliver at all. In fact, 3-4 years ago, there was the trade facilitation agreement which countries could arrive at. But I think from an Indian perspective, what remains important is that if the WTO gets a shot in the arm, it's good for a country like India because otherwise the rest of the world, and including the entire global trading order, gets cut into blocks depending upon geostrategic alignments, which is a somewhat unhealthy trend that is emerging. And for a country like India, which is kind of at the cusp of taking a leap forward to be among the world's 3-4 top economies over the next 10 to 15 years, which it cannot do without being a much bigger player in global trade. It's important for India to act by a system which is a common set of rules, because otherwise India has to fall in line with rules set by other more important countries,
Right.
which might not be exhaustive rules.
Sure. Right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Amitendu. Pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much.